Thanks for coming along. My name's Dom Hallis. I run Codec, or the Coalition for a Digital Economy, which is a lobby group for tech startups in the UK. So first of all, who are we to be talking about this topic? So we represent the community to government and to policymakers. So I spend all of my time, along with Joel, who's here on the call as well, our head of policy, talking to politicians, policymakers about what kind of support can be offered to entrepreneurs like yourselves when you're building or driving your business. Ultimately, most of the time that comes to things that are more what's the best way of putting it, more day-to-day issues. So bulk of our work is on things like access to talent, so immigration policy and skills policy, access to finance, so what are the incentives for starting a business, and then how do we make sure we have a strong venture capital ecosystem to scale your business. And then regulation, everything from online harms to data protection issues to the government's AI strategy. And that's in what we would typically be doing, but obviously right now, as a result of the broader crisis, we've been really focused on how do we make sure we can get the possible support, the best possible support from government for you guys as you're developing your businesses and trying to make sure you survive through the period. And how can we communicate outward to people like yourselves exactly what support is available, and be honest about what support might work for you and what support won't work for you. So that's what I'm going to do today. I'm going to walk you through the kind of broader spectrum of support that's available. But first, I just want to talk a little bit about the challenge. And we know, for example, that there's an awful lot of businesses that are working at seed stage and above who are potentially at risk during this period, because we know lots of people will need to raise funding and are going to struggle to do so. So we've already seen, according to the Bohurst data, a 32% drop in investment in Q1 this year. And obviously that, Q1, at the end of the Q1, was the only real period of Q1 that was impacted. So we're going to see a substantial change going forward. So, we're really, really conscious that there's going to be huge challenges. And not only that, but, we've been asking, and our partners in other parts of the ecosystem have been asking really important questions about what support is available. So I always think there's two ways to tell the story. There's one which is in the data, which shows that nearly half of startups see the coronavirus outbreak as an existential threat to their business, and that 9 out of 10 of startups see huge problems with cash flow. Or you can tell it by the stories that are in my inbox, which are of term sheets that have been pulled, or rounds falling through, or one startup where they'd signed term sheets and they'd got all the way through to due diligence, and then they've had offers pulled. So we know that there's been a huge impact as a result of this outbreak, both on the business environment and your ability to sell your products, but also the ability to raise money to continue. And so, as well as the sort of support that that I'm going to outline the government has already been offering so far, I'm also going to talk a little bit about what work we're doing at Codec to try and get you the exact kind of support you need on top of what already exists. So, first of all, what's out there right now? I'm not going to go through every single government initiative there is going. We're going to talk a little bit about the sort of specific things that we think are most impactful for the ecosystem, and some of the things that aren't. And then if you have any more questions or any other things that are specific to you guys, do put them in the chat. I'll put my email in the chat as well at the end, and you can feel free to reach out. And we'll make sure that if we have really specific questions that relate directly to your business, and there's sort of challenges in me answering them, or frankly that the government hasn't produced enough information for me to answer them so far, that we're fed into government, that we're engaging and making sure that you get answers. So the first and probably the most important scheme for tech startups, and the ones that you guys will probably most often use, is the Coronavirus Job Retention Scheme, also known as the furlough scheme. And ultimately, we know that despite the best efforts of companies around the country, like, the reality is that many people will have to be furloughed through this crisis to see through this period when both liquidity but also sales have dropped off a cliff. So what is it in practice? It's a scheme that allows companies to access government grants to cover 80% of furloughed workers' wage costs, up to £2,500 a month. So these workers remain on the payroll, but they're not able to work for the business during that time. The scheme is backdated to the 1st of March, and the reason why it's backdated to the 1st of March is because if you had employees that you'd already laid off prior to the creation of the scheme, you can essentially rehire them and put them on furlough. So it's a way of, sort of responding to the fact that people might have acted immediately before the government acted, so it's trying to bake that in. And payments in terms of the sort of the grant money that will come back will be made at the end of April. In terms of applications, in terms of like how it works, you'll need to designate your employees as furloughed workers and notify them in writing. And so we were doing a similar conversation yesterday, and one of the changes that the government has brought in is that you can furlough and unfurlough your workers back and forth if you need to, but you do need to submit all of that detail in writing, because at the moment HMRC's portal, which they're expected to complete by the end of April, isn't in place yet. So you need to make sure you have the paper trail in place to say exactly how you've been acting through this period, to make clear like which workers are on furlough, and the sort of broader details, so that you can make sure that when you engage with the government, when you have questions from HMRC, you have the information available to you. So that's the furlough scheme. The other big scheme that the government has been pushing is what's called the Coronavirus Business Interruption Loan Scheme, or the CBILS scheme. And ultimately, the idea of this is that companies will be able to get loans that are interest-free for 12 months, that are 80% government guaranteed, to be able to continue their businesses and essentially to be able to provide liquidity to cover fixed costs and things like that. Now, we know, and we've been engaging extensively with the government about the fact that these loans like largely aren't suitable for venture-backed companies. So, we've heard that both from, hundreds of startups at this point who've engaged with banks and had huge problems, but also directly from the banks who acknowledge that the viability criteria, which essentially means that loss-making businesses are ruled out, just simply do not allow businesses to access these loans, because only quote-unquote viable businesses will access these loans. And I mean, when you think about that, it's entirely reasonable in the sense that as a sort of startup that is a kind of venture-driven model, you would never have sought loan financing to begin with. That is not a logical way in which you would finance your business. But ultimately, it means that startups have been locked out of the key capital lifeline that the government has created for businesses. And so we're really keen to try and create a new one, and we can talk a little bit in more detail further on about what that looks like. But if you're not that kind of venture-backed driven model, we would encourage you to engage with the banks. There's a list of providers on the British Business Bank's website, and you should be speaking to them and seeing what would be available to you. Third thing is statutory sick pay refunds. So the idea is that for any businesses up to 250 employees, you'll be able to claim a refund on any statutory sick pay paid due to coronavirus. So the idea is like that ultimately, if people have to take time off sick because they're either ill or self-isolating, you as an employer will not have to pay for that. It will be covered by the government. The scheme covers all types of employment contracts. So, everything from 0 hours to full-time. You won't need a doctor's note from employees. But you will need a record of why the employee didn't work, what days qualified for statutory sick pay, and things like national insurance numbers and stuff like that. Ultimately, this is a scheme that the government is working on, but hasn't sorted yet. So there'll be more information that will come out on that in due course. But that's a sort of mechanism that will be available to employers, but at the moment is being set up. Business rates, reliefs, and grants. So this is another big chunky package that the government has put together, but specifically focused on things like retail, leisure, and hospitality. So when it comes to retail, leisure, and hospitality businesses, things like pubs, etc., they'll pay no business rates between 2020 and 2021, so in this tax year, and they're also getting grant funding of different sizes depending on how much their rateable value under the council tax rating system, how much their rateable value is. Ultimately, for this relief, you don't need to do anything because your local authority, your council, will talk to you and say you are eligible or you are not eligible. One of the things that we've been working on at Codec is to make sure that things like co-working spaces, which currently aren't covered by the relief, do get covered. And we're aware that there are a bunch of businesses that are in our ecosystem that are directly impacted by coronavirus in a very similar way to things like hospitality and leisure businesses that thus far don't have access to this kind of relief. So we're working really hard to make sure that they do get access to it, but ultimately for the time being, these kind of categories of businesses, and if you have any queries on what category of business you are, ultimately you'll be categorized by your local authority, by your council. So that they're the people you have to engage with to make sure that you are either covered or not covered. But if you're one of those kind of businesses, the local authority will actually be in touch to say you're eligible for the grant. VAT and self-assessment payments. So all VAT payments for businesses have been deferred until the 30th of June, so essentially for this quarter. And income tax for self-employed people that had been due in July has been deferred until January 2021, which is the next sort of payment cycle. The important thing to remember with this is that you'll still have to pay, you just have to pay later. So ultimately, like, the idea is to give you more liquid cash now, but either way, you're going to have to pay more later. So it's just being super aware of what that will mean for your cash flow further down the line. And it may be, based on some of the conversations we've been having in government, that this could get extended, but there's no confirmation on that yet. So ultimately, you know, for the time being, you have to make sure that whilst you may have access to this cash now, you're ultimately going to have to defer it later. So being super aware of what that will mean for your cash flow going forward. In terms of, again, these are automatic offers. This will automatically happen. So businesses just don't need to make a VAT payment during this period. Your accountant, if you have one, should be able to deal with that, no problem. And you'll be given until the end of the next tax year to pay any liabilities accumulated during this deferral period. So ultimately, you'll have to pay it at the end, basically. The HMRC time to pay scheme, which essentially is you have to, if you're having issues with either broadly more financial distress or outstanding tax liabilities for your business, you should call the number here, the 0800 0159 559 number, which is HMRC's dedicated helpline. And the idea is that they will agree a package of support for you to try and help you get through this period. There's two sort of pieces of anecdotal feedback that we've been getting on this. The first is that it's been really, really hard to get through. So we've had waiting times up to an hour to call HMRC. But the second is that ultimately when people have called, like, it talks a little bit here about agreeing installments or suspending debt collection or cancelling penalties and interest. Like, in most cases, the response they've got from HMRC is call us again in 3 months, because ultimately we're going to for the time being, we're going to deal with it later. And so I think the assumption is that these will be pushed, a conversation that will be pushed off into the future for the time being. Then it comes to self-employed income support, which is the other sort of big chunky scheme that's supposed to be essentially similar to the idea is that this is a partner scheme to the furlough scheme. So it's the same kind of scheme as the furlough scheme, but for self-employed people. And that's why the numbers look broadly similar. So it's a scheme that provides a grant to self-employed people worth 80% of their profits up to a cap of £2,500 a month, using the average profits from tax returns of the last 3 years to calculate the size of that grant, and assuming that the person who's self-employed would have trading profits of less than £50,000 in 2018, 2019. Obviously, we're well aware that one of the challenges with this is that in the case of many sort of partnership structures, like, there would have been different ways in which people would have received payment. It wouldn't necessarily just have been through a sort of a typical kind of a typical profit system. So we're trying to engage with the government on some of those conversations, but frankly, we haven't made much progress. In terms of timeline, like, the government says they're going to start paying this out by the beginning of June, which is an awfully long time to wait. And again, there is a lot of pressure on the government to try and get this operational quicker. But we're continuing to work with other partners across the sort of small business ecosystem to see what more we can do, because obviously that's hugely problematic for many self-employed people who have seen their incomes plummet. So this is our kind of broad brush verdict on the schemes that we're looking at. And a sort of sense of what works for startups and what doesn't. So, I mean, what particularly doesn't work is the CBIL scheme, which we're working on an alternative for, which I'll talk to in a minute, and the business rates relief scheme, which frankly just doesn't cover the kind of businesses that are so critical to our ecosystem. But actually, the other schemes are pretty good, and the packages that the government has put together do tend to work, although there will be a bit of administration involved in them. But we would absolutely encourage anyone on the call to make sure you take advantage of what is available to you and do so as fully as possible. But as you can see, when I talk about the kind of the coronavirus, the CBILs, and even some of the job retention, the furlough scheme is whilst theoretically they work for businesses and are accessible, they're not necessarily suitable or they're not necessarily used. But I think the point is that the CBIL scheme is simply unsuitable and won't work, whereas the job retention scheme, whilst startups, as we see here, 78% of people who identified as startups don't plan to access the job retention scheme either, ultimately it will be available to you. So if you do have to use it, please do. But we realize the challenge of furloughing workers when you only have 5 workers to begin with, and therefore would be grinding to a halt, is hugely problematic. And that's why we're trying to work on a better capital system that will allow you access to cash to sort of get through this period. So what are we working on? What does that look like, that package that I talked about? The first is urging the government to implement a sort of equity-based liquidity package suitable to save the startups that are at risk. So we have seen in France a €4 billion package designed by the government specifically for our ecosystem. In Germany, a €2 billion package, and we're trying to push the government to come up with something suitable through the British Business Bank that will allow companies to take additional capital without the need to take on loans, which simply won't work for them and their business model. The second is the idea that we can fast track payments to startups from things like R&D tax credits, which we know are super important for liquidity in the ecosystem, and also Innovate UK grants, which again, the Innovate UK has a huge pool of cash available to them as a result of their increase in budget during the budget this year. And their ability to sort of push out that money to the ecosystem as soon as possible. And actually, you will have seen this week a sort of small start to that process where they announced a £20 million scheme for startups to bid for funding to help with coronavirus response. But the idea that that kind of money could be used and bolster the liquidity of the businesses in this period, alongside, frankly, any other pot of capital the government has available to them to push out. That's what we're trying to get, as much of that money into your pocket as possible to help you survive this crisis. We're also working on a specific kind of program around co-working spaces, where we know that there's huge problems for them through this period because you guys can't work from them, you're all stuck at home. And so they're going to need rates relief and some other support to survive these crises. And then the sort of fourth thing that we're working on at Codec that I think we really need your help with is identifying a whole range of sort of smaller knock-on effect issues of this broader challenge and the broader economic crisis and what that means for this ecosystem. So I'll give an example is over EMI, where we know that a huge number of startups in the ecosystem use the Enterprise Management Incentive Share Option Scheme to provide share options for their employees. And we had a question, and it wasn't clear under the guidance how that would interact if an employee was furloughed. Because ultimately, the impression would be if you were furloughed and you weren't on formal employment, then you might lose access to those options. So we've been working with the government to make sure that that isn't the case. We're hopeful of getting that resolved, but that's exactly the kind of sort of niche issue that is specific to our startup ecosystem that we want to make sure the government is able to engage with and we're able to get answers on. And then more broadly, in order to do all of this, in order to get all the things we want, we've just launched a new campaign, which launched Sunday, called Save Our Startups, with 20 sort of founder partners from the UK startup ecosystem. And I think there's now, it says 2,000 signatures there. I think we're now at over 3,500 signatures from the ecosystem. So we would encourage you to sign up to that. It's just at saveourstartups.co.uk or at Save Our Startups on Twitter. And we're trying to make sure that we push as hard as possible with the government to make sure that companies in our ecosystem that we know are so important to the economic recovery will get the support that they need right now to make sure they can be part of that economic recovery. So thanks very much. I really appreciate it. More than happy to take any questions now. I don't know what's the best mechanism to do that, Bianca. Shall I just run through the questions on the chat?
Yes, thank you so much first, Dom. That's really useful.
No
we
problem.
Do have a few questions. So thank you, Federico, for the extra clarification, on the VAT bills and the fact that you should pay attention to direct debit. And then we do have a question from Posh Gurung about how do you calculate the 8% of the salary per year?
So the idea is that ultimately, if someone goes over the £2,500 in total per year, although I don't think actually thinking about it, that wouldn't necessarily be the case there, that ultimately the maximum the government would pay is 80% of their salary. Does that make sense? So in that case, where I think that it would be, just checking my maths now terribly. In that case, the 2,500 would amount to 30,000 a year, I think, right? This is my terrible maths. Then the whole point would be, it would just simply, in the case of 29,000, it would just be 80% of their salary that they would be paid. Like it's that simple. 1 second. We'll go to the top. Yeah, that's a very good point, actually, which is like, if people have direct debits set up to pay their VAT bills, they absolutely should cancel that direct debit. Otherwise the payment will go through. So you need to make sure, whether if you're doing it yourself, like definitely do that. If you're doing it through an accountant, make sure that you talk to them, because that's going to be really, really important, because it's the sort of thing that you might just neglect to do so. there's one question about a serviced office and how business rates are structured. The good thing about, like I said, the honest answer is it sounds from your description like you might not be eligible, but ultimately the council will reach out to you and clarify that themselves. They're going to reach out to everybody who would get the grant to engage with you. So ultimately it's a sort of, the local authority will reach out if you are eligible. But I think that if you're getting a zero rates bill every year because you're getting sort of broader rates relief, then I don't think you receive that. Although Joel, you can correct me if I'm wrong on that. Hang on, let's keep going through. Yeah, so I mean, I think that the honest answer on the CBILS point, the main thing is that, look, like ultimately the banks each have their own processes that are slightly different for this. So it will depend on the banks involved, and like, you know, you're going to have to go and engage with them and see exactly what the structure is. I mean, I think that we've heard some horror stories about banks trying to push, you know, companies to products that aren't suitable and, you know, and are not working effectively. But I think the main thing is that, you know, you go and have that conversation with them, see what might be available to you. They'll you know, explain what they can offer under the terms of the way in which they're operating at the moment. But we've been really clear, just based on the kind of the growth-driven model of many venture-backed companies, that frankly, like in most cases, they simply won't be suitable, and you're unlikely to be able to qualify for the loan scheme that exists. Yes, so on the should people continue to pay the salaries? Absolutely, please do so. I think the idea is that what you need to do is you need to like place that in writing as best possible. So you make really, really clear, as I kind of did a bit further back, and I'm happy to scan back to that page in a second, what kind of information you need to provide to employees in writing. And then in terms of the timeline, you know, the idea is that the portal will be up and running by April, early April is the suggestion from HMRC. But ultimately, like in terms of reimbursement, we don't know yet, and we realise that is a huge problem, and that's one of the things that the government is being pushed super, super hard on. Jane's question, which is entirely right, is we're surprised that 78% of startups don't intend to use the furloughing at all. I think that's something that we were super surprised at. I mean, I think that ultimately that will probably change over time, would be my take. I think that for the time being, people are you know, I think for the time being, people are intending to try and see it out. And I understand ultimately, if you have a small number of employees and that's critical to the running of your business, you don't want to shut up shop completely. But it might be that changes, and you've seen, I'm sure, some of the coverage in the past day or two that the furlough scheme has been more widely adopted than the government had necessarily anticipated originally. So it might be that it's just taking a bit of time to get through to the startup ecosystem. In terms of Antonio's point on the right information to share, like I'll push back to this page. As far as I can tell, there isn't a template, although I'm sure that there will. Like, I don't have a template, but I can try. Joel and my team can follow up and make sure that we get one over to you, because I'm sure that there'll be people who will be working on that sort of thing at the moment. There you go. So it says specifically, so you need to notify them in writing, including the date the furlough starts, when it will be reviewed, and how to keep in contact during the furlough because they'll only be allowed to keep in contact in certain ways through that period. So as long as you're notifying your employees and everything in writing, that's the most important thing. Are there any other questions?
I can't see any other questions coming through, but Dom, would you mind, you said at the beginning that you can leave your email address there if there are any questions
absolutely
after the session. That will be very helpful. And if you guys have any other questions after the session, there's a follow-up email, and then you can definitely revert to that one, and I'll connect you to Dom, and he can provide the information that you need. If there are no questions anymore, then I would like to thank you, Dom, for your time, first of all.
Thank you.
Thank you for the information that you've provided, and thank you all for attending. And then again, if any question afterwards, please do revert to my follow-up, and look forward to seeing you to the next session. Goodbye, everyone.
Great stuff. Thanks, guys.
Good
really
luck.
appreciate it. Cheers.
Bye.